Hi, I'm Rainer and welcome to my train room. Today I thought I would do a little bit of fencing, I guess. So you may have seen it in my last video, the one where I did the tour of the whole layout, that I had a little bit of kind of fencing leaning against the back edge of the layout here. So that was just there temporarily because I was doing a test fit to see how it's going to work. And now I'm going to actually try to do some work back there. So to begin with, if you want to look back, I did this backdrop, and all the backdrops on my layout, for anybody who's new here, are all photos that I took myself at various points, and then I had them printed out as banners at Staples. And if you want to look back at some of my older videos, I'll put a link in the description showing you some of the videos where I did some work on the backdrops if you want to do something similar yourself. But today I'm just going to try to do a little bit of work on kind of what I see the transition between the real world, the layout, the flat horizontal surface of the layout, and the vertical photo in the back. It's not really a forest, it's a photo of a forest representing the world going off into the back. And on the top deck of my layout, where I've done things like this, I have put either buildings in front, trees in front, or grass in front. There's got to be something to transition from the horizontal benchwork of the layout to the vertical surface in most cases. Otherwise, it doesn't end up looking very believable when you end up with this clean-cut line where it transitions from this flat rail yard and tracks and whatever the ground cover is to this vertical trees that are very obviously in the distance. You need some kind of a transition in between to allow your eye and your brain to transition between this surface and the back one. And in some places where it's natural vegetation, just some grasses, bushes, trees will do the trick. Or you can have buildings in front, which is a normal thing to see. Something like right over here where this building is, your ground hits that, and then there's a little bit of backdrop showing behind the building. So that's a fairly normal thing. But right here, I don't have a lot of gap. There's probably only about an inch or so, maybe a little more than an inch between the track here to the backdrop and where those box cars are sitting back there up to that building. It's even less. So I didn't want to just put bushes along there. It's going to look a little bit weird having just straight bushes in between or grass or anything. I wanted to do something a little bit different. So that's one of the things I want to address. The second thing I want to do is this building right here is just a background flat. And if you look back at my older videos, you can see that straight on, because of the lighting I've done in there, it looks it looks like it has some depth when you look at it straight on. However, when you look at it from an angle this way, it's pretty obvious that the thing is only about 3/8 of an inch deep, and you can see a little bit of brown wall and trees right there. So I want to do something to disguise the fact that it's not a full building going back. So that's really something else that I want to play with and try to disguise that edge of it. So what I have is 3 types of fencing here. And the first one is this chain link fencing that's actually made out of, I guess, that chicken fencing, the square wire with some mesh on it. Now, this is one of the guys at the train club where I'm a member at. He had made a pile of this fencing for the club, and I asked him for a section of it, and I wanted to try it on my layout. So he gave me this piece, and I think I'm going to try to get that incorporated into the back. And it just does a pretty good representation of chain link fencing. So I'm hoping to get that planted back here. And I've got to get it stand vertical. And then I'm hoping to put some grass and bushes and maybe some weeds or something along the front and some ground cover to help it blend in. Also online, I bought a few sections of this silver plastic, looks like guardrail. I think I got it on an AliExpress, something like that. And I think I have 3 or 4 sections of it, but I'm going to see how that can work back there. And then the last thing I'm going to do is, or actually the first thing I'm going to do is, I made up this section of wood fencing, and it's just a section of foam core with those little craft stir sticks that I cut up. When I did this yesterday, I cut up some stir sticks and glued them on here just with some craft glue. And then I used some India ink diluted with isopropyl alcohol to stain them kind of grayish, make them look a little older. So what I'm thinking of doing is using that right beside this building, and then because it is pushed out from the wall like a 1/4 inch because of the foam core, I can put some kind of trees overhanging the fence. I've done something similar on another section of fence that I did a few months ago, and hopefully that will disguise the side of the building. I also made some trees up yesterday, made some trees for the club layout, and at the same time I made some half trees for this, and I'll show you what I mean by those later in the video. So anyway, that's the plan. I'm going to try to see what I can do to kind of, between this building over here and that building where the box cars are sitting, I'm going to need to move all these train cars and these buildings out of the way so I can work without knocking everything over, and I'll have to reposition the camera probably so that you can see things well. But that's kind of the plan. I want to see what I can do to disguise that bottom edge of the wall meeting the layout, and see what I can do to make it look a little more believable. So this is where I have to so far. Glued in my section of wood fencing at that end. Just used some craft glue to hold it in place. Once that had set for a bit, I glued in my metal chain link fencing. I just used some of the same craft glue and just kind of held it in place. And then on some alternating posts, I put a little bit of super glue in there, top and bottom, just to make sure it stayed in place. Once that had kind of set a little bit, I ended up making up another section of wood fencing at that end, just a little bit taller, and using the same stir sticks, just made it a little bit taller the same way, glued to a section of foam core. But this one, just to vary the color a little bit, I first painted it with a quick coating of Floquil Rust paint, and then I used the India ink on it. So it came up with this blackish brown, kind of a dirty looking old fence. Again, once that had dried, that the paint had dried, I glued that into place at that end. And then I cut the sections of my plastic, the guardrail fence. Looks like a metal guardrail fence, but it's actually plastic that I bought online. Ended up using 2 sections plus a little bit at that end. Cut those to fit, glued them into place, and then Once all that fencing had dried, I went along and just kind of brushed little bits of brown, various colors of brown acrylic paint on it to just look like rust spots on the metal fence. And down here, I also put a couple of little bits of gray paint looking like somebody had touched up the guardrail or whatever, just to make it look old and used and weathered instead of brand new shiny fence. Both ends, what I did was I put in trees, 2 trees there, 1 down there, and those trees I made up some trees the other day, and you can look back at some of my older videos for full videos on how to do the trees, but basically I just make them out of twine and copper wire and then some foliage materials. And what I do is I just cut up the twine into short sections and then unravel the separate fibers, take a piece of copper wire and bend it around a little pin or a screw that I have in a piece of wood, spread a little bundle of fibers in between there and spin it with the cordless drill. Once I have a batch of them ready like that, then I just kind of shape them a little bit into a tree-like shape with the scissors, stick them into a piece of styrofoam to get them to stand up and stay there fairly securely, take them out in the garage and give them a spray of flat brown paint. And once the brown paint had dried, I use some spray adhesive and just spray them with the spray adhesive and sprinkle the foliage materials on them. And then my final step with them is to just mist them with some green paint, and then I sprinkle some short static grass on them. I actually didn't do the static grass on these trees, but a lot of times when I'm trying to do coniferous looking trees, I sprinkle just a light dusting of static grass on them, and it just gives them that extra little bit of highlights to make them look like new needles or whatever growing on them. So now there's other videos that I show it in more detail of how I do the trees, but basically that's how I do it. Now with these 2 there and this one down here, what I did was after I had painted them brown, I actually cut all the branches off down one side to make the back side of the tree flat before I went and did the foliage materials. That way I can tuck them into the foam core behind my little wooden fence, just slide them in there, and then they sit flat against the wall. And my idea with that is down here, and especially on this side, it disguises the fact that my building is only, 3/8 of an inch deep. Because if I have a camera, for example, in a train and I'm coming down the track this way, what you're going to see is this backdrop with all the trees and the lake in the background. And then you'll see some trees, actual 3-dimensional trees sticking out. So that way you're not looking at the side of a only 3/8 of an inch thick building. You're actually seeing some trees and then the building beside the trees. So it disguises it a little bit. Obviously, in real life, you look at it, you can see that it's a wall. But the whole idea with all of our modeling here is to, I guess, create the illusion that there's more depth than this narrow layout. And that's what I'm trying to do with my buildings. When you look at my buildings, when the light's on, the one down there, this one here, these buildings down here, I put images inside and lights so that when you look at them, it creates the illusion of depth, more depth than what there actually is. And the same thing with a backdrop like this. The idea is to make it look like the layout continues off into the distance. And, my whole thing here with the fence at the front is just to create that transition, to try to create a somewhat believable transition from what actually exists here to what is in the image behind there. Once I had the fence secured and the glue had dried and it wasn't falling over anymore, I did some ballasting on the track. Like I had ballasted up to the corner of that building down there, but I did some more ballasting on the track, on this rear track, and a little bit on these other ones. Now I have to be careful because I have a lot of switches here and I don't want to foul up the points with ballast. So I kind of go light with the ballast. For the ballasting that I did along the rear track down at that end, I used some more of this Woodland Scenic's medium ballast. They call cinders. I'd done that for the rail yard, and it's an extension of the rail yard, so I continue with the same ballast there. Now, for this gray ballast down at here, I used some of this cheap jar of gravel I got at Dollarama, and it's a very fine grit, the stuff that I got. It's very similar in in size to the Woodland Scenics ballast, but cheap jar for $2.25. The only, I guess, complaint I have of it is that it's a little bit shiny, some of them. But when I use the matte medium to water it down, it actually kills a lot of the shine in it because the matte medium covers it, and well, it's more of a matte color. And what I did up at the top of my layout at that end where I used some of this ballast is I actually went over it later with some acrylic paint just lightly to stain it to simulate oil and stuff dripping out of the train. So I'm probably going to do some of that later, just kind of to weather the ties and the ballast a little bit more. I'm not doing that right now, but I will probably do that later when I'm doing some other weathering on the tracks and things like that. And then from where the ballast edge is to the fence, I put down some of this slightly coarser black, dark gray black gravel, also a jar of gravel that I got at the dollar store. So I put some of that down there. And to glue down the ballast, what I do is I give it a misting with some isopropyl alcohol. I use one of these bottles because it sprays a really, really fine mist and doesn't blast the ballast all over the place. A lot of spray bottles will give more of a stream and then just move your ballast around this. As long as you hold it far enough away, it gives you a nice little fine mist. I don't know if you can see it, but it's just a very fine mist that pumps out. And then to actually hold the ballast down, what I do is I use one of these little squeeze bottles and just dribble it onto the ballast after I've misted it with the isopropyl alcohol. And the glue in here is actually some of this Liquitex matte medium that I mix at probably about a 10-to-1 ratio of one part matte medium to about 10 parts water. So it's very diluted with water. I just dribble that onto the ballast that has been, pre-soaked with a little bit of isopropyl alcohol, just misted, not really soaked. And because I put the alcohol down first, this stuff just immediately absorbs. It doesn't bead up. It doesn't move the ballast around at all. You just put it down and it just soaks right in. And then I left it to dry overnight. So I did that last thing before I went to bed last night. So now it's nice and hard and yeah, it's not moving anywhere. It's absolutely solid. But the nice part with the matte medium is that it is slightly flexible still. You can't tell with the ballast in it, but it's slightly flexible so it won't crack. So next thing I need to do here now is I am going to start putting in a little bit more vegetation here. I'm going to probably put some static grass and longer clumps of static grass down at the base of the fence here, down in the corners, and maybe try to simulate some little vegetation hanging over the fence in places. My whole goal is to try to make it look like a believable transition from these tracks and used and maintained areas to the forested areas in the background, and just to try to blend the two together so it's kind of a believable scene instead of what I started with, which was plywood and tracks to a photo of a background. So the idea is to create that transition so that your eye can kind of accept that change going from one to the other. So that's the next step, getting some more grass, vegetation, other things in there to try to blend it in a little bit more. So this is the end result of what I've been doing over the last few days, at least for this video. I've added a bunch of vegetation, different plants, long clumps of static grass, some vines hanging down from the fence in a few places. And it helps blend the fence in, makes it look like it's been there for a while, and gives you a bit of a visual divider between this foreground and the background, but it looks like it belongs there, at least in my opinion. I'll show this shot coming down from this way to show you how those trees kind of disguise the edge of the building. Obviously, you can see that it's a flat building, but it kind of hides the fact that it's only this thick. Anyway, hopefully this will give you some ideas if you're dealing with a scene, something like this on your railroad. You know, you can put some fence in there, and sometimes that fence will work as to make that whole division between this flat land out here and the background to make a little bit more sense. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you want to go look back at some of my older videos of how I did these photo backdrops, I'll put some links down in the description. And the same thing with some of these buildings, like this building and the buildings down at the other end, how I built those backdrop flats, and what I did for lighting inside them, and the images that I put inside to give them a little bit more depth than they actually have, or to make it look like they have more depth than they actually have. Anyway, thank you for watching, and if you haven't subscribed, please subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see you next time, and I'll leave you with this.